My name is Dave Hollenbach, the host of From Embers to Excellence. My goal is to explore the many facets of leadership from the perspectives of some amazing people. In addition to leadership, I like to discuss mental health, PTSD, and overcoming adversity. If you have a favorite episode, I would love to hear about it. Message me through social media or my website, and I will share some free tools to help you achieve your goals. Please like, subscribe, and leave a review. If you haven't purchased your copy of my book, Fireproof, please grab a copy today. Thanks for listening. Today I'm speaking with Bryan Gillette. He is the author of Epic Performance, Lessons from 100 Executives and Endurance Athletes on Reaching Your Peak. Bryan has over 25 years experience in leadership and organizational development with executive and senior level responsibilities in small and large companies. Before starting his consulting practice, he was on the executive committee as the vice president of human resources for a mid-sized global technology company. In addition to running human resources and payroll, he has extensive experience in leadership development, organizational design, communications, and mergers and acquisitions. I have been really excited about this conversation. Your experience and the endurance athletics, the not just your achievements in your professional life, but your achievements in your personal life. It's just incredible. And I always love talking to people that love to talk about leadership. So thank you so much for having this conversation with me.
Dave, it's a pleasure to be on your show. I appreciate you having me here. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, let's start with where you were born and raised, and really maybe some of the early influences that led you on this path that you're on today.
Yeah. So I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. I live about 45 minutes east of San Francisco in the suburbs. And I was born and raised probably about 10 miles from where I'm living today. So I've always lived in California or in kind of in the San Francisco Bay Area, or even a little bit further east when I went to school up in near Sacramento in Davis. Some of the so that's where I am today. I love it here. My family members are in the area, so it's nice to stay here. But I also love to travel, and maybe we'll dig into that later on. The early influencers, I think my parents are clearly two of the earliest influencers. My mom was always very athletic, played soccer even into her 40s. In fact, she played more soccer as an adult than she did as a kid. She didn't play as a kid. And my dad was the same. They formed this adult soccer league 50 years ago, and it still runs today. And I saw how they stayed active when they were in their 30s and 40s. And when you're a kid and your parents are 40s, you think that's really old. And they still continue to be relatively active. My dad, right now, who is 83 years old, is hiking across 96 miles across Scotland. So he is my inspiration, and I hope that I can continue to do that. But I saw that competitiveness of my mom. I got some of that, and I saw that just drive to kind of keep going from both my mom and my dad. And they were great role models, and they still are to this day.
And were they really in the corporate world as well? Is that kind of what uh, led you to go down that path?
No, they weren't. My dad, for all intents and purpose, should be either in jail or dead because he grew up and I mean I say that it's true, and I say that if he were here as well, because he grew up. He had a really rough childhood. Grew up where his parents were gone. You know, there was a part of the time he was living on the streets. He was in and out of foster homes. And so you look at the statistics, and the statistics would not indicate he was going to have a successful life. There were just so many headwinds against him, and he turned it around. He ended up he was in the army for a short amount of time, and then or in the military for a short amount of time, and then learned construction and he ran his own construction business for most of the time when I was a kid. But he got into construction, and then he built custom homes and just some beautiful homes in the San Francisco Bay Area. So that's what he was doing. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. I mean, she was a secretary kind of early on in her career, and then was a stay-at-home mom for as long as I grew up. And I loved that. I loved the ability that my mom was there, but I also liked that my dad worked out of the house. I mean, he would go to the job site, but his office was in the house. And so I could at any time go down and just, chat with him. And so that they were very present in my life. And I think that framed who I became as a father. But just these tremendous role models. So I mean, I had no desire to go into construction. My brother went down that path. I was not going to go down that path, and I went on to college. Got my master's and kind of went into the corporate world. And I always knew that I would go that direction. I don't know. I'd love to dig in to where it came from, but I just don't know where that kind of came from because it wasn't from my parents.
And you've got a couple of bachelor's degrees, and then you've got an MBA, correct? Am
I
I?
do, yeah. So originally I was going for a bachelor degree in an organizational in communications, and then I noticed if I took a couple more classes and kind of do my senior year, I really push it hard in my senior year, I could get a second undergraduate degree. So I double majored, and then that senior year was tough. I then went in and worked for a financial services company right out of college and just had this great job, had some great mentors. It was a great organization. And while I was there, went back and got my master's. So I was going to school at night and then working during the day.
And um, what led you into like the human resources arena?
I I had a lot of people had told me that I was good kind of in leadership and managing people. I had had some good experiences in college. I had some good experiences in high school. I refereed soccer, up to the kind of the professional ranks. And I was good at kind of managing difficult situations. And just a number of people said, "Oh, you'd probably be good this way." And so I started to explore it. And where early on, where I was really interested is going down that learning and development, that training and development space. And as I was talking to one of my early mentors, I had explained this is what I was looking to do, and I was only a couple years out of, probably a year or two out of college at my first job, and he said, if you're going to go down that rank, what I recommend you do is just get some real leadership experience. Go in and manage a team. And I did that, and I continued to manage teams for a long time, but it gave me that practical experience early on, and I think that is so critical. I see a lot of consultants who never really manage, that they talk about leadership, but they never really managed a team. And you got to understand what it's like to manage a team in order to be able to help people manage
Right.
a team or manage people. So that's a little bit about kind of the, to your question.
And now, did you start traveling the world while you were still working for an organization, or was this when you went into your entrepreneur career?
Yeah. I got a love of travel from my parents, and we traveled. We didn't travel a ton, but we did. My parents recognized that it was important to go travel, and so we did a lot of travel in the United States. And then the first time I went to Europe was when I was in high school. And it just gave me that passion for travel. And then I had, a number of the jobs I had allowed me, my first job, or the first company I was at, I took many trips to Europe and was teaching classes in Europe. And so that kind of continued to get me interested. And whenever I'd get a chance to go somewhere, I would take it. Then in 2005, I hadn't been with my, at the time, girlfriend, now wife, and the company I was at, I was traveling with them, but we had just gotten acquired, and I thought, you know, the future isn't going to be as exciting as it was in the past with this new organization, and I love the company I was at. So I thought, I'm gonna take 7 months off and travel around the world. And so the girlfriend, I asked my girlfriend, and she was interested. And I thought, it's a really good test for a long-term relationship. If you can travel with somebody for 7 months, then
Yeah.
there's a good chance of success. And so we did that. And I always asked the question, before I did it, and I was nervous about doing it. I asked that question. It's like, will I regret not doing this in 20 or 30 years? And the answer was pretty quick, and that it's like, okay, I'm gonna go travel around the world. And we took 7 months off. Toward the end of that 7 months, I proposed to her on the Great Wall. And then we got married. We've got two boys, and we took them out of school for a year a couple of years ago and traveled for a year around the world. And again, it was that same question: is will we regret not doing this in 20 or 30 years? And when we answered yes, it's like, okay, we got to figure out how we can do it.
Yeah.
And we did.
Man, that's awesome. That's really cool. And then there's in your book, you have these executives and athletes, and you're taking these leadership lessons, and I would imagine a lot of it. I actually I'll defer to you. I have my thoughts on it. I went through the book a little bit, but I am uh, not as familiar as you, obviously. So,
Yeah.
can you talk a little bit about that? What is this EPIC acronym?
What's the EPIC framework stand for?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's five kind of core behaviors as part of EPIC performance. And what EPIC stands for, it's the first four. E is what do you envision kind of around your career, around the future, around work, around your personal life, of the big things that you want to accomplish? How do you envision those things and see the future? And then the P is, how do you put a plan in place in order to get to that vision? So what do you have to do when you're looking 20, 30 years out? What's that plan you should be thinking about? I is, how do you iterate to that plan? You don't start off being the chief of the fire department. You start off, at a much lower level, and you work your way up. And that's what iterate is. I, as an endurance athlete, I didn't start off, running 200 miles around Lake Tahoe. I started off at much shorter paces. My first training run was 4 miles. And then you worked it up to a marathon, and then a 50 miler, and then a 100 miler, and eventually a 200 miler. So that's what iterate is. The C is, how do you collaborate with other people who've come before you, whether they have been successful or they have failed in it? But how do you collaborate with them, learn from their successes, learn from their failures? Because fundamentally, there's not a lot of stuff that is super new out there. You can learn from other people that have done the same or something similar. And then lastly, you got to go out and perform it. And you got to stand at the start line and work your way to the finish line. And so that's what epic performance is all about, and kind of what the epic stands for.
Yeah. And what inspired you to write your book?
Yeah, there were three things that kind of encouraged or inspired me to write it. I've always wanted to write something, but these three kind of got me into have something and get it framed. I'm an avid cyclist, and I've always liked to cycle, and I was doing something that was, I thought, would push my mind and my body to the limits, and that was riding 300 miles in 24 hours. So it was one day, 300 miles, and earlier in the day I saw somebody die. Earlier in the day I collided with another bicycle that required me to get a new front wheel, and it just shakes you a little bit. But when I got to mile 275, I realized I didn't hit that limit that I thought I would. And maybe we put these limits in our head, and it holds us back from accomplishing more. And so as I got to 275, and kind of the last 25 miles, and realizing, I can push myself further. I'd always been a cyclist, never a runner. And I thought, I'm going to run a marathon. So before I got to the finish line of that 300 miler, it's like I decided I'm going to run a marathon. And I trained for the marathon. I did the 20, that. I did the 50, a couple 50 milers, a 100 miler, and then eventually a 200-mile run, which is 8 marathons back to back. And it's like, okay, I know I can push myself really hard. And so what is it allows me to do that? And then the last thing that really kind of told me that I got to do this is before we traveled around the world for a year with our kids, some friends held a going away party. And I had a number of people that came up to me and said, we love what you're doing, but we could never do it. They said, I could never do it. And and I thought, why are you telling yourself you can't do it? And you're just, you probably can. Now, if you don't want to, I get that. But again, they were shutting off something that maybe they could actually do if they really wanted to do it. So the combination of those three things got me thinking, and I knew what I had done to kind of get to that trip or get to the 200-mile finish line. But I wanted to learn from 100 other people and what are some of the things that they did. And that's why I went out and I did about 75, executives and then about, 25 to 30 ultra distance athletes. There's some overlap with some of these just to understand these are people that can think really big, that think long term, and what are those behaviors that they do in order to reach the finish line, whatever that finish line is for them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've interviewed quite a few people on this program where you know you can see a lot of leadership development occurs in the early life through sports,
Yeah.
and sometimes it's team sports, sometimes it's individual sports, but you learn these lessons of working with other people, collaborating, and then that self-reliance piece,
Yeah.
that grit, pushing yourself further to make bigger gains,
Yeah.
and that self-discipline piece. And I feel like there's so much that we can learn from these high achievers, you know, just how to manage our everyday lives.
Yeah. And that's what was so exciting. I love doing the interviews because I was learning so much. Just learning, what they did as leaders because some of these people risked a lot. I mean, they risked a lot of money at times and they knew how to manage risk very well. Now, your profession probably knows how to manage risk better than most professions because you don't just run into a burning building without assessing the situation. And so you guys, I think, probably do a better job than most people. And so it was interesting to talk to these executives about how they feel about risk and, what gives them the confidence to go into a difficult situation and then be successful or at times fail and then get back up and do something else.
And can you talk a little bit more about that? And what did you discover?
Yeah. Well, a couple things I found out, what surprised me about risk, because I asked, everybody, it's like, okay, what's your comfort level with risk? And you may be able to relate with this, but most people said is I want to minimize as much risk as possible. I would have thought it's like, oh yeah, I'm very comfortable with risk. But that wasn't the answer. They said, what we do is we look at how can we manage the risk? How do we manage the downside? So we're not just, we don't just go and jump into the pool without looking down into the pool and to see if there's obstacles. And we know that there's going to be risk, but we know how to manage it. And it just that's what I expected them to be a lot more comfortable with risk and said, no, yeah, we don't like a lot of risk, but we know how to manage it.
Right.
Um,
And that is, I guess, part of the iterate process, learning how to manage risk.
yeah, yeah. In the plan, you identify kind of what risks are there. What are some of the risks that you may have with whatever your big endeavor is? And then as you go into plan and iterate, it's like, okay, how do I manage these risks? I know what they are. How am I going to minimize them as much as possible? And part of it is, you don't jump into the deep end of the pool. Maybe you jump into the shallow end and then you slowly swim to the deep end, or you practice it. You don't run into a burning building without kind of assessing the situation. And when you run into that burning building, you've run into hundreds of others in a training situation. So you know how fire works, you know kind of what some of the signs are you have to look for. And so when you hear a certain noise, or you feel a certain thing, you know it's time to leave the building.
Right.
And that's the same thing in business. It's the same thing in sport. You kind of understand some of those situations. I mean, I guess I pose that question to you. Is that similar to what you experienced being in the fire industry?
Oh, without a doubt. There's times when I've gone into burning buildings with somebody that has very little experience. As a company officer, or, maybe a second in chief officer, I'd go in on a very large scene and uh, advance a hose line into a burning building, and know, like, as it starts getting hotter and hotter, I'm getting closer to the fire. But if I'm down on the ground because it's so hot and the only uh, temperature that's bearable is at the floor, I
Yeah.
probably need to move out if I haven't made it to the seat of the fire yet, or if I don't have water on the fire. It's not going to get better on its own. It's just going to continue to get hotter. And I mean, there's a lot of conditions that could result in catastrophe if you're not smart about it. And
Right.
you learn,
Yeah.
as you go.
And that's what that iterate is. I mean, I had some conversations with, one founder of a company ended up selling his company for about $4 billion. He's doing all right, and he is now that he skis all over the world. And so when it's summer up here, he's down in South America skiing. And he's just this phenomenal skier. And I talked to him, and I also talked to his ski coach, and they said, both of them kind of said that, we often look at the worst case scenario. And in order for the worst case scenario to happen, a series of events likely would have had to happen before it. And are you aware of those series of events? And then what we really should be looking is, what is the most realistic worst case scenario, and how do you manage that? But we think what holds us back is we think about the worst case scenario, which is death, complete annihilation, loss of all money, whatever that is, and that's what stops us. And so how do we think about, realistically what, I mean, you think of going into a burning building, the worst case scenario is you don't come out.
Right.
And it happens far more than we'd like it to happen. But how often does it happen? I mean, what is the realistic worst case scenario that you have to deal with? And so how are we managing a little bit more to that? Because it's that worst case scenario will stop us in our tracks. You would never find somebody to go into a burning building.
Yeah. So tell me some of the lessons that you were able to glean from interviewing the athletes.
Yeah. The athletes and the executives, it was the same. And some of the key elements that I heard from these 100 people is they're very focused on where they want to go in the future. So they don't let fate decide what the future is going to look like. And I know there are people that said, you ask, oh, what do you want to do in 20 years? And their response is, I'm just going to kind of wherever it takes me. And these 100 people, that was not their response. That is not my view as well. I'm not going to just kind of let fate take me to wherever it wants to take me.
Right.
I'm going to have, here's where I want to go in 20 years, or here's where I want to go in 5 years. And I'm going to drive to get there. And that's what these 100 people, they knew, they were focused on what they wanted to do. And they were very deliberate on how they worked to get there. So they knew what to say yes to that would take up their time and money. And they also knew what to say no to. One of the guys that I interviewed, he's a head of HR for a technology company, just very successful. He was a FIFA referee, so he's a soccer referee at the highest level of the game. and he's also an Ironman. So he has and he's got two daughters, so he's got a busy life.
Yeah.
And so as he trains for an Ironman, I said, how do you do it? How do you balance all these things out? And he talked about how he's very deliberate with what he does and what he doesn't do. And he goes, I know when I have to train for an Ironman, I have to find 12 hours in the week. I can find 12 hours. What that means is I have to say no to doing maybe this thing. But we have 168 hours in our week. We all have that same amount of time. It's how we use that time is what differentiates these. And so he knows I got to find those 12 hours. I'm going to find them, and that'll allow me to train in order to do the Ironman. So being very focused and being very deliberate were two areas. The other one is, they're just had a lot of confidence. And that confidence came from kind of successes early on, or when you iterate. When you iterate and you succeed at that smaller task, that gives you the confidence to move to something bigger. We don't all start off at the deep end of the pool. We start off in the shallow end of the pool. We get that confidence, we get that comfort, and then we work our way into the deep end. You think about it, the water in the deep end and the shallow end are no different. It's up here in our head that prevents us from moving there. And once we can get into our head, then we can more easily be successful in the deep end.
Did the book confirm more than teach you?
I don't know if the book, writing a book, you learn a lot. Talking to the 100 people, there were some things that confirmed in my mind, and then there were some things that I learned. And so I tried to bring all of that into the book. Just, I'll give you one of the examples. One thing that I knew intuitively, but I didn't kind of really embrace it enough, was when when I determined that I wanted to interview 100 people, I thought, how many people am I going to have to ask in order to get to 100 yeses? And I only had 2 no's. And what it confirmed, but then also taught me is, if you don't ask, the answer is going to be no. If you do ask, the answer just might be yes. And so whenever I'm faced with, it's like, oh, I need some help around something. It's like, should I ask that person? Should I ask Dave to be on his podcast? He could say no, but if I don't ask him, I'm not gonna get on there. If I do ask him and he says no, it's like, okay, I'm in the same spot as if I didn't ask. But if I do ask him and he says yes, which you did, and thank you, then all right, I've learned from that. So just the fact of go out and ask. And if you ask, you just might get a yes. So that's where that book, I learned from it, and I learned some things. It's like, oh yeah, I got to do that better. There's 5 behaviors. I don't do all 5 of them great. And most people don't. Most people will do 2 or 3 of them really well, and they know how to compensate for the other 2 or 3.
So how has your life changed since interviewing these 100 people and really putting the book together? I mean, and I mean that, and not really how has it changed in the sense of going around speaking about your book, but
Right.
fundamentally, what things have changed in your life?
Yeah. Other than the fact that I get to talk to cool people like you, that's more, but and I love that. I interviewed one person. He's a superintendent of a 15,000 student school district. And I've seen him operate. I know what he's like as a leader, and I've just been impressed with kind of his demeanor. And I was talking to him and asking him, a number of questions, and he said, whenever somebody throws out an idea, I like to try to figure out that calls to me. No matter how crazy it is, I like to figure out how to say yes to it. And coincidentally, About a year after I interviewed him, and I'm in the middle of writing the book, he calls me up and he said, "Hey, Bryan, I want to raise $330 million for the school because there's a lot of things that we want to do to improve the school. And I want to do this through a political campaign, a bond campaign. So where you put it on the ballot and people vote for it." He goes, "Will you run it?" And it was one of these things that I have no experience running a bond campaign. I hate to ask people for money, and you've got to raise about $130,000 to do something like this, for this specific one. I don't like asking people for money. I don't know anything about running a campaign. I'm good at managing projects, and I'm good at kind of marshaling people and kind of getting people moving in the same direction. It aligned with my values. It seemed like I could find the time to do it. It seemed like a cool opportunity, and it was good for the school. So I said yes. And I said, "You do realize that I know nothing about running a bond campaign." And he said, he goes, "I've never run one either, so we can go through this together." But I could learn. And it was, I mean, it's just it's a crazy, amazing experience to do that. I learned a tremendous amount. And he was the one that kind of got me thinking about when somebody throws a crazy idea out. And I don't think he was thinking he was going to ask me to do the bond campaign then. You say yes. And so I did. I'm glad I did. And we lost by about 600 votes.
Wow.
And of a population of 48,000 voters. And I never regret making that decision. It was a big failure on my part. And I would say yes. If we were to go back in time, I would do it again in a heartbeat. But it didn't result in what I wanted. And so it really showed to me kind of what changed more so is me is when somebody presents a crazy idea that really calls to you, try to see if you can say yes. And then even if there's a high chance of failure, and I don't think there was a high chance of failure, but there was a chance of failure and we did, we often worry about failing, and it's like, I did, I'm fine. and I moved on.
And
So
what's interesting to me is, that you're talking about this, because then it's almost like you overcame that. Because I'm wondering, did the fundraising come after the
all the money came before the election. So we were able to raise the money before the election. Once you lose election, it's hard to get money for that. So you
for
got to
that
get it.
cause?
Yeah, you got to get it beforehand.
So you were the co-race director for the Pleasanton Run for Education.
Yeah, it's funny because so the person I ran the bond with is the same person that we started up this run. And so it was her idea. She and I, partnered up with it. And for the first 4 years, we kind of ran this run. And, we took it from nothing up to, over 3,000 runners. And it was just this phenomenal community event. We would net about $100,000 for the event, a whole lot of work. But it's something, and now I'm not involved in it. I've passed it on. Somebody else does it. But I go to the event and highly successful, and I look at it and it's like, I'm proud of what that has become. I'm proud of my involvement for it.
And it raises money for education, right?
It raises money for education, which, at the core, it's like, how am I spending a part of my time and part of my resources to improve education in our community?
And so that's what I was talking about, is like you campaigned for this cause. It did not succeed, but there's still this continuing on after, where
And they're two completely separate events. So I was doing the run first, and then I had kind of backed away from the run, let it to somebody, and then I did the campaign afterwards. But it all ties into things that I find is important, and I think that's kind of the key thing, Dave, is really understand what is it. I'm asked a lot. We're often asked for money or my time. And so I will look at, when I'm asked to do something, to volunteer my time, I'll often ask myself three questions. You know, is it something I will learn from? Is it align with where I want to spend, where I want to help? And there are a couple areas, organizations, or kind of areas that I want to help in. And then will I learn something, and will it, will it be fun? So I ask myself those questions. If I can't say yes to all, then it's like I'm not going to do it. If I can say yes, then I have to figure out, okay, how am I going to fit it into my time? Is it the right thing?
Yeah. Yeah, awesome. No, I just see that connection between, the charity, the 501(c)(3),
Yeah.
raising funds for education, and, it may be two different events, but at the core,
It,
you're doing things for education.
You're right. Yeah, because that's something of like, okay, I can add value here. So, and that's why it made it easy for me when the superintendent asked, "Would you run this campaign?" It's like, okay, it deals with education, and I'm going to learn a tremendous amount, and I think there's it could be a fun kind of good people to work with, and it's like, all right, I got to do it.
And how has that experience? And so I'm asking these questions because I find that sometimes, we go through these experiences, and what we're trying to achieve, we fail at. But what we do achieve is learning something more valuable than if we had succeeded.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so what I'm curious is, was there a lesson that came out of that was actually more valuable to you than actually achieving success of the campaign?
For me, it was, I can take on these big things, and we ran a really good campaign. It just didn't get enough votes. Um, I can take on these things, I can learn, I can fail, and I can still get up and do something again. And so that was one of the big lessons. And so it was being less afraid of failure is kind of that big lesson. It's like I remember as a kid, kind of like probably seventh grade, and being at the school dance. And when I was a kid, we would be at the gym, and there would be like all the seventh and eighth graders, and all the boys would be on one side, and all the girls would be on the other side. And if you wanted to ask somebody to dance, you had to walk across the gym, which seemed like a mile and a half to get there, because you'd identify somebody and you'd start walking to them, and then you'd ask them to dance. And if the answer was yes, it's like, okay, that's great. But if the answer was no, you had to walk all the way back across the gym, and it was embarrassing. And I remember just that fear of stopping me from walking across the gym because I was afraid of the no. And in realistically, if I got the no, what's the worst that's going to happen to me? Yeah, I'm going to feel embarrassed. I'm not going to feel great, but I'm probably going to survive it. And I think that those types of things, we often, we're afraid of that failure. We're afraid of what it's going to do, but chances are we'll be able to survive it. I mean, a lot of people have failed at a lot of things, and they seem to do all right. And so how do we get comfortable? Grant, I don't like to fail. And when we lost the campaign, I was more disappointed that we didn't get the money for the school than kind of how it impacts me. But it's like, oh, that stings. But you got to get up and you got to move on.
Yeah. And what kind of lessons did you take away from these interviews? I mean, did any of them talk about failure?
Yeah, I mean, a bunch of them talked about failure, of some companies that they had started. I talked to one CEO who he started a couple of companies, and he had some big successes in a big company, and then went and started another company and then sold it off. Not at a huge profit, but he still sold it off. And then he started two others, and they didn't go. And it's interesting to learn that we all have failures. And so how did he get through it? Again, it's like he's got other successes that he can live on. And when you start companies, there's also, that there's a high chance of failure rate, more fail than don't. And maybe it was too early. So I learned a tremendous amount, and everybody was very open about talking about how, yeah, we have had some failures. But what differentiates them from somebody else is they had the failure, they got up, they learned from it, and they tried something different and moved on. And granted, everyone would say, hey, I'd rather not have the failure, but here's what I learned. Let's not repeat that again.
This book feels to me like it was written for anybody that wants to achieve more in their life. Did you have a certain kind of person in mind?
It's exactly what you said. It's that, I'm not out here to kind of show somebody that, hey, you should go and run 200 miles. But at the end of the day, excuse me, it's for that person that may be thinking they can get, this level, but how can they push themselves a little bit higher than that? So you're not going to see me running into a burning building. But we all can figure out what's important to us. What do we want to do? Set those goals. And I'm thinking, all right, you could probably set it a little bit higher as a stretch. So, my target audience is in some cases, it's that person that's just starting their career, that they can think about, what is it, where do I want to shoot 20, 30 years down the line as opposed to 1 or 2 years down the line? Or that person that maybe is in the middle of their career and trying to, it's like, I got to do something different, and maybe is afraid to go travel around the world, afraid to quit their job and start their own company. That it's like, what could help them cross that bridge is really what we're looking at.
Uh, it's really cool. I'm really enjoying this conversation. When I did a lot of research for my book, and uh, I went through some stuff towards the end of my career in the fire service, and and I discovered this program at Yale, the Grand Strategy program at Yale, which is, for people that are likely going to be leading large corporations or find themselves in high level leadership positions in the government.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to be making decisions that affect our country, long into the future.
Right.
And so there has to be this understanding. There has to be a plan. You have to know where you want to be and work your way back. What are the actions that I need to take to get us to here that will then allow us to get to here, and then
Right.
so that that iteration piece that you have in
It's that iteration. But first, you got to be able to see that finish line.
right.
You got to know, what is it that we want when we get to where we want to go. And not enough time is spent there. And then once you know what it looks like and you can visualize it in your head, you can put it on paper, whatever it is, then you got to figure out, okay, what is my strategy to get there? And everybody has different plans. I mean, I talked to some people who like, yeah, we had everything written down, and I had some people, their plan was on the back of the napkin. But then it's like, how do you iterate? You don't change the world, overnight.
Right.
And what are those things? And I often, as I'm talking to folks, is, let's get to what your big thing is. And then what do you have to do in the next 72 hours to move one step closer to that? If you want to be a firefighter, then what is that one thing you have to do tomorrow to learn a little bit more about firefighting, to figure out what the avenues are, to interview a firefighter? So what are those? What's that one thing, even small, that you can do in the next 72 hours? And then what's the next thing? So just start doing something. Even if you don't have your complete plan rolled out, just start doing something. I often, when people ask me, it's like, how do you, what's the first thing I should do for to run a marathon? And I say, sign up for one. Don't worry about your plan. Sign up for one. And then you've just put some money down and you've got something on the calendar. And don't do it in 2 weeks, but sign up for one maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 months down the road. And then go research a plan and find a plan. But the hardest part about running a marathon is signing up for it.
Yeah. Yeah. Really cool. Really cool. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me. For the people out there that have enjoyed listening to this, that find themselves craving that your book in their hands, they got to go out and get it. What's the best way for them to get a copy of your book, and the best way for them to connect with you and learn more about you?
Yeah, well, first of all, Dave, I appreciate you having me on your podcast. I appreciate your service to our community and all that you and your colleagues do to keep us safe. And so I appreciate that. So the best way to get in touch with me is you can get the book, Epic Performance: Lessons from 100 Executives and Endurance Athletes on Reaching Your Peak. You can get that on Amazon. Just go onto Amazon and type in Epic Performance Bryan Gillette, and you'll find it. The other way to get in touch with me is you can go to my website, which is epicperformances.com. So that's EPIC performances with an S.com. And that'll give you my bio. It'll link you where you can contact me and learn more about me in the book.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed going through your website, and there's just so much information on there. And yeah, your website made me jealous. So. Really nice website.
Thank you. I appreciate your time, and thanks a lot, Dave.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for listening to this episode of From Embers to Excellence. Please visit hollenbachleadership.com for additional content, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a review.